Good evening. Welcome to another journey into the heart of darkness, where the lines between reality and imagination blur into obscurity. Tonight, on Friday Night Frights, The Red Room, we delve into a classic tale by the master of suspense and the uncanny H.G. Wells. The Red Room is not merely a ghostly tale, but a profound exploration into the deepest, most primal fears that lurk within the human psyche. Picture, if you will, the grandeur and decay of Lorraine Castle, a place where history whispers from every stone and shadow. This ancient fortress, shrouded in the mists of time, stands as our setting, a character in its own right, enshrouded in tales of the supernatural and the inexplicable. Lorraine Castle, with its turrets piercing the sky and its halls echoing with the steps of the past, has long been the subject of whispered stories in the nearby village. Tales of a room painted in the deepest, most unsettling shade of red, a room that has been the cradle of unexplained events, of disappearances, and of a fear so tangible it seems to seep from the very walls. Enter our protagonist, a young man whose name is lost to the annals of time, but whose confidence is as striking as it is misguided. This bold soul, with the fire of youth still burning in his eyes, is resolute in his skepticism of the supernatural. He scoffs at the tales of ghosts and phantoms, dismissing them as mere superstitions of the feeble-minded. In his overconfidence, he vows to spend a night in the Red Room of Lorraine Castle, to prove once and for all that the supernatural is but a figment of the imagination, a relic of a bygone era of ignorance and fear. Our young narrator arrives at the castle as the sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that seem to reach out towards him with spectral fingers. The caretakers of the castle, a group of elderly individuals whose eyes speak of unspeakable things seen and unheard, greet him with a mixture of pity and dread. They warn him of the room's malevolent reputation, of how it has been untouched by time and unaltered since the last unfortunate soul dared to challenge its mystery. Undeterred, our narrator listens to their stories, each more unsettling than the last. Tales of how the room was once the heart of the castle, vibrant and full of life, until a series of tragic events left it stained with an aura of death and despair. They speak of the previous occupants, brave souls who entered with laughter and left with a madness that clung to them like a shroud. But to our narrator, these are but fanciful tales, the ramblings of minds clouded by superstition. As night descends upon the castle, enveloping it in an inky cloak, our narrator prepares himself for his vigil in the Red Room. Armed with nothing but a candle and his unwavering disbelief in the supernatural, he ascends the winding staircase to the room that has been the subject of so many nightmares. The door, ancient and heavy, opens with a groan, revealing a chamber bathed in shades of crimson, as if the room itself were bleeding. Inside, the Red Room awaits. The walls, adorned with tapestries that seem to move in the flickering candlelight, close in around him. Every shadow appears to hide a lurking terror, every whisper of wind a spectral breath. Yet our narrator remains steadfast in his resolve, determined to face the night and emerge with his skepticism intact. Little does he know, as he settles into the Red Room, that the true horror lies not in ghostly apparitions or malevolent spirits, but in something far more ancient and far more terrifying. For in the Red Room, the boundaries of reality begin to fray, and the darkness of the human mind is unleashed. with its ivy-clad towers and shadowed hallways, has borne witness to centuries of history. Built in the time of knights and kings, it has stood as a guardian against the ravages of time and man. But within its stout walls lies a room that has been the source of whispered fears and uneasy tales. The Red Room. This chamber, named for its deep crimson walls, has remained locked and untouched for generations, its story a patchwork of tragedy and unexplained occurrences. The lore of the Red Room speaks of a curse, a darkness that clings to the very fabric of the room. It is said that those who spend a night within its confines are never the same, their minds touched by an unspeakable terror. Tales tell of brave souls who entered with laughter and skepticism, only to emerge with eyes haunted and voices tremulous with fear. The room, they say, has a presence, an entity that preys upon the mind, twisting thoughts and amplifying fears. Into this legacy of dread steps our narrator, a young man of science and reason. A scholar, educated in the light of rationality and logic, he views the tales of Lorraine Castle with a skeptic's eye. To him, the stories of the Red Room are but relics of a superstitious past, shadows cast by the unenlightened minds of yore. With a heart fortified by skepticism and a mind armed with logic, our narrator approaches the gates of Lorraine Castle. The structure looms before him, its stones whispering tales of battles and intrigues. As he crosses the threshold, he is greeted by the caretakers of the castle, a group of elderly individuals whose eyes speak volumes of the secrets they keep. Their reception is one of veiled warnings and somber tones. They speak of the Red Room in hushed voices, their words laced with an unspoken dread. They tell him of the room's history, of the unexplained events that have transpired within its walls. The room, they say, has a life of its own, a malevolent force that feeds on fear and darkness. But our narrator listens with a skeptic's ear, his belief in the rational and explainable unshaken. He assures the caretakers that his intent is pure, to spend a night in the Red Room and emerge unscathed, proving once and for all that there is no room for the supernatural in the world of the living. The caretakers, resigned to his resolve, lead him through the winding corridors of the castle. The walls are adorned with tapestries that tell tales of glory and sorrow, the floors echoing with the steps of those long gone. As they ascend the staircase to the Red Room, the air grows colder, the shadows deeper. His journey through the castle's corridors was akin to a descent into another world. The walls, lined with portraits of stern ancestors and faded tapestries, seemed to observe his progress with a silent, oppressive scrutiny. The air was heavy, as if saturated with the echoes of whispered secrets and unspoken fears. The creaking of the floorboards under his feet served as a haunting accompaniment to his thoughts, each step resonating in the hollow halls. The castle itself was a labyrinth of stone and shadow, its architecture a testament to a bygone era of grandeur and solemnity. Suits of armor stood as silent sentinels, their vacant helmets gazing into nothingness. As he passed, the faint light of his candles cast ghostly shadows upon the walls, the light flickering as if in a dance with the unseen. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, our narrator's confidence did not waver. He moved with a purposeful stride, his rational mind dismissing the superstitious warnings of the caretakers as mere folkloric remnants. To him, the Red Room was but a room, its crimson walls no more capable of harboring spirits than any other chamber within the castle. Upon reaching the door of the red room, he paused, his hand resting on the cold, iron handle. The weight of history pressed upon him, the tales of those who had entered before him lingering in his mind like a distant, dissonant melody. Yet, with a determined turn of the wrist, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The red room greeted him with an oppressive embrace. Its walls, a deep, dark red, seemed to absorb the light from his candles, creating an ambiance that was at once both enthralling and disquieting. The furnishings were sparse, the few pieces cloaked in sheets, giving them an ethereal, almost spectral appearance. A large, unadorned mirror stood against one wall, reflecting his solitary figure in the flickering candlelight. He placed the candles around the room, their flames casting a warm, yet insufficient light against the pervading darkness. As he settled into an armchair, his gaze traversed the room, noting the absence of dust and decay. It was as if the room had been waiting, preserved in time for its next occupant. The silence of the red room was absolute, a void where even the sound of his own breathing seemed intrusive. The young man leaned back, his eyes fixed on the play of shadows upon the walls, his mind alert for any sign of the supernatural. But as the minutes ticked by, with only the sound of the clock to keep him company, he found his initial apprehension giving way to a sense of triumph. No ghosts, no spirits, no malevolent forces, he mused to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the encompassing silence. Just a room, a red room, and nothing more. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere within the room began to shift. The flickering of the candles grew more erratic, casting bizarre, dancing shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The oppressive feeling of being watched, of being not quite alone, began to creep into his consciousness. Our narrator tried to shake off the feeling, chiding himself for letting the atmosphere affect his rational mind. He reminded himself of his purpose, to debunk the myth of the Red Room, to prove that fear was but a product of the imagination. Yet, despite his efforts, the room seemed to close in around him. The red of the walls appeared deeper, more menacing in the dim light. The silence, once a void, now felt heavy with anticipation, as if the room itself was waiting, biding its time. The young man's eyes were drawn to the mirror, where his reflected image appeared distorted, almost unfamiliar. The flames of the candles in the reflection danced wildly, as if caught in a tempest unseen in the room itself. Suddenly, a draft, cold and unexplained, swept through the room, extinguishing one of the candles. The darkness grew, encroaching upon the islands of light he had created. His heart began to beat faster, the sound echoing in his ears like a drum of war. In that moment, our narrator realized that the battle he faced was not against specters or wraiths, but against his own mounting dread, against the shadows that lurked in the corners of his own mind. The Red Room, with its oppressive crimson walls and suffocating atmosphere, was not merely a chamber of brick and mortar. It was a crucible for the fears that reside deep within the human soul. As another candle flickered and died, the darkness grew bolder, encroaching upon the shrinking pool of light where he sat. Each shadow seemed to twist and coil with a sinister life of its own, a dance of darkness that mocked his attempts at rationality. The oppressive feeling of being watched intensified, and he could almost hear the silent whispers of the room, taunting him, challenging his disbelief. His gaze returned to the mirror, and in the dim light, his reflection seemed to warp, the edges blurring as if reality itself was bending, tainting his perception with a hue of nightmare. With each passing moment, the young man's confidence waned, eroded by the relentless assault of fear and the unyielding presence of the room. The rational explanations and logical deductions that had armed him at the start of this venture now seemed like distant, feeble whispers, drowned out by the thunderous beat of his own heart. A sudden, inexplicable chill filled the room, as if the very air was being drawn into a vortex of cold despair. The remaining candles sputtered in a desperate fight against the encroaching darkness, their flames a last stand against the consuming void. In a moment of chilling realization, the young man understood that the terror of the Red Room was not a ghostly apparition or a spectral presence, but something far more primal and insidious. It was the manifestation of his own deepest fears, a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of his psyche. The room, with its oppressive red walls and suffocating silence, had become a realm where the boundaries between the real and the imagined, the material and the psychological, were blurred. He was trapped not by locks or bars, but by the shackles of his own terror, a prisoner within the confines of his mind. As night descended like a shroud over Lorraine Castle, the Red Room began to transform under the cloak of darkness. Our young narrator, ensconced in his chair, watched as the shadows grew longer, stretching across the crimson walls like dark, sinuous fingers. The flickering candles, his only allies against the encroaching night, cast an eerie, dancing light, giving life to the inanimate and creating phantoms in the corners of his eyes. The silence of the room, once a mere absence of sound, now took on a presence of its own. It was a heavy, expectant silence, pregnant with unspoken whispers and the weight of the unknown. The young man found his thoughts turning inwards, to the tales and warnings of the caretakers, to the legends that had so long haunted the Red Room. His skepticism, once a solid shield, now began to show cracks under the relentless barrage of his own imagination. With each passing hour, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier, as if the air itself were thickening, becoming a tangible presence that pressed against his skin. The young man fought to maintain his composure, to keep the rising tide of fear at bay. He reminded himself that there was nothing in the room but himself and the four walls. Nothing that could harm him, nothing that could justify the dread that was slowly coiling around his heart. Yet, as the candles burned lower, their light struggling against the oppressive darkness, the room seemed to close in around him. The walls appeared to draw nearer, the crimson hue deepening to the color of blood in the dim light. The shadows in the mirror moved in a way that defied logic, their shapes undulating like living things. The young man's eyes darted around the room, seeking out the source of his discomfort, but finding none. He could hear the blood pulsing in his ears, each heartbeat a drum of mounting terror. The rational explanations and logical deductions that had fortified his resolve now seemed like distant, feeble whispers, drowned out by the growing chorus of his fears. A sudden noise, soft yet unmistakable, broke the oppressive silence, the sound of something stirring within the room. The young man's breath caught in his throat, his eyes straining in the dim light to identify the source. But there was nothing there, nothing but the shadows and the flickering candlelight. As the night deepened, the room seemed to grow colder, the chill seeping into his bones. The young man wrapped his arms around himself, trying to ward off the cold and the creeping sense of dread that accompanied it. The darkness felt alive, a malevolent entity that sought to engulf him, to swallow him whole. The flickering shadows on the walls now took on sinister shapes, forming faces and figures that seemed to watch him with unseen eyes. The young man tried to dismiss them as tricks of the light, figments of his imagination, but the harder he tried, the more real they seemed. His mind, once a bastion of logic and reason, now teetered on the brink of panic. He could feel the tendrils of fear wrapping around his thoughts, clouding his judgment, whispering of unseen horrors lurking in the darkness. The Red Room, with its oppressive atmosphere and haunting whispers, was no longer just a room. It was a battleground, a place where the young man fought against the demons of his own mind. The candles, now burned down to mere stubs, cast a feeble, flickering light that did little to dispel the darkness. The young man's eyes were drawn to the mirror, where his reflected image appeared distorted, almost unfamiliar. The room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the walls breathing, the shadows moving with a purpose. In a moment of desperation, the young man reached out to snuff out the last candle, to plunge the room into total darkness. He thought that perhaps, in the absence of light, the shadows would lose their power, that the fear would dissipate. But as the candle's flame died, and the room was swallowed by an impenetrable darkness, the young man realized his mistake. The darkness was not an absence. It was a presence, a suffocating, smothering entity that filled every inch of the room. The young man's heart pounded in his chest, a frenzied beat that echoed in the void. The silence of the room was now a deafening roar, a cacophony of unspoken terrors that screamed in the darkness. He felt a presence in the room with him, a malevolent force that reveled in his fear, that fed on his terror. In the darkness, the young man's mind conjured images of unspeakable horrors, of malevolent spirits and vengeful phantoms. He imagined twisted, grotesque figures emerging from the shadows, their whispers filling the room with a chorus of madness. His rational mind, once his greatest asset, now betrayed him, painting a tapestry of terror with each frantic heartbeat. Panic began to claw its way to the surface, a primal, uncontrollable fear that threatened to consume him. His breaths came in short, sharp gasps, each one a struggle against the overwhelming dread. The darkness pressed against his eyes, a physical force that seemed intent on suffocating him. The young man realized the true horror of the Red Room. It was not a place haunted by the spirits of the dead, but by the living terror that dwells within the human mind. The room was a mirror, reflecting back his own fears, amplifying them until they became unbearable. The oppressive presence in the room grew stronger. He could feel it closing in around him, a noose of darkness tightening with every panicked thought. In his mind's eye, he saw the room as a living entity, its walls pulsing with a malevolent energy, its shadows reaching out to him with ghostly fingers. Desperation took hold, a frantic need to escape the suffocating darkness. He stumbled to his feet, his movements erratic and uncoordinated, his only thought to flee the room, to escape the nightmare that had ensnared him. But in the impenetrable darkness, he found himself disoriented, the familiar becoming foreign, the room a labyrinthine trap. His hands flailed in the darkness, searching for something, anything, to anchor him to reality. But all he found was emptiness, a void that seemed to mock his plight. The young man's mind raced, every rational thought drowned out by the tide of fear that surged within him. In his panic, he collided with the furniture, the impact sending sharp jolts of pain through his body. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror that consumed him, a fire that burned in his veins, an all-consuming inferno that threatened to engulf him. The young man's screams were swallowed by the darkness, a silent cry in the void. He felt as though he were drowning, the darkness a sea of terror in which he was sinking deeper and deeper. The room, once just a room, was now a tomb, a prison for his mind, a place where fear reigned supreme. As he collapsed to the floor, his consciousness teetering on the edge of oblivion, the young man understood the cruel irony of his plight. He had entered the Red Room seeking to dispel the myths of the supernatural, only to become a victim of his own fears, a prisoner of his own mind. The darkness enveloped him, a shroud of terror that smothered his thoughts, his fears, his very being. In the heart of the Red Room, the young man surrendered to the night, his mind lost in the shadows of fear. In the deepest throes of his terror, our young narrator lay defeated on the cold floor of the Red Room. The darkness around him was no longer just an absence of light. It had become a living, breathing entity, feeding off his fear, growing with every frantic heartbeat. In this moment of absolute despair, the young man's thoughts turned inwards, introspective and revealing. He pondered over the nature of fear, how it could warp perception, twist reality, and birth monsters from the shadows. He realized that the Red Room, with its oppressive aura, was a catalyst, igniting the dormant fears that lay buried in the human psyche. As our narrator, ensnared in the grip of the Red Room, felt the very fabric of his reality warp under the weight of an unseen horror, the terror that had been simmering beneath the surface began to boil over. The room itself, with its blood-red walls and suffocating silence, seemed to pulsate with a malevolent life. Each shadow appeared to stretch and reach towards him as if imbued with a sinister intent. In the clutches of this all-consuming fear, our narrator's mind became a battleground. Each rational thought was overwhelmed by a deluge of primal terror, his scientific skepticism crumbling under the relentless assault of the unseen and the unknown. The shadows in the room coalesced into nightmarish forms, each one a manifestation of his deepest fears, a parade of horrors conjured from the depths of his psyche. The oppressive presence in the room grew more tangible, a suffocating force that seemed to press against him from all sides. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing in his fear and exhaling a darkness so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. The air grew thick and heavy, making each breath a labored gasp, as if he were drowning in an ocean of terror. Our narrator's heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat echoing the chaos of his thoughts. His eyes, wide with horror, darted about the room, seeking an escape from the nightmare that had ensnared him. But there was no escape from the Red Room, no respite from the terror that had been unleashed. The young man's mind raced, every rational explanation and logical deduction drowned out by the rising tide of fear that surged within him. In a moment of chilling realization, he understood that the terror of the Red Room was not a ghostly apparition or a spectral presence, but something far more primal and insidious. It was the manifestation of his own deepest fears, a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of his mind. The hours passed. each minute an eternity, as the young man lay enveloped in the darkness. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks of the red room, piercing the all-consuming darkness, the young man felt a subtle shift. The oppressive weight of the room seemed to lessen, the suffocating grip of fear gradually loosening. In the dim light of the new day, the room appeared transformed, the shadows retreating to the corners, the crimson walls no longer menacing, but merely walls. Exhausted, both physically and mentally, our narrator rose unsteadily to his feet. His eyes, now adjusted to the faint light, gazed upon the room with a new understanding. He saw it not as a supernatural menace, but as a reflection of his own inner demons, a manifestation of his deepest, unspoken fears. As he emerged from the castle, stepping into the light of the early morning, our narrator felt as though a veil had been lifted from his eyes. The world around him appeared the same, yet he viewed it through a different lens. The experience in the Red Room had changed him, had forced him to confront the reality that the most profound terrors are those we conjure in our own minds. He understood now that the human psyche is a fertile ground for fear, a labyrinth where the shadows of doubt and uncertainty lurk around every corner. The monsters we fear, the specters that haunt our dreams, are often of our own making, born from the depths of our imagination. Our narrator's journey into the Red Room was a descent not into a physical space, but into the recesses of his own mind. It was a journey that taught him the power of fear, the way it can warp perception and twist reality. He had sought to confront a legend, only to confront himself, to face the darkness that resides within each of us. And so, we close the chapter on The Red Room. It is a tale that serves as a stark reminder of the power of fear, a story that whispers to us in the silent hours of the night. In the end, the greatest hauntings are those that we create within ourselves, the phantoms that reside in the corridors of our minds. Thank you for joining me on this enthralling journey through the shadowed corridors of the Red Room. We have traversed together through the winding paths of fear and confronted the phantoms that lurk in the depths of the human mind. It is in these darkened rooms of our psyche that the most chilling of tales find their birth. As the veil of night descends once again, I invite you to join me for the next episode of Friday Night Frights, where we will delve deeper into the realms of horror and the mysteries of the unseen. Together, we will explore tales that chill and unsettle the soul, stories that linger in the mind long after the lights have dimmed. If tonight's tale has awakened a thirst for the macabre within you, I urge you to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the notification bell. Your companionship on this journey is cherished, and together we will uncover the secrets that the shadows hold. Until we meet again under the cloak of the next Friday night, keep the candle burning and the mind open. The darkness awaits, and with it, the tales that reside in the hidden corners of our world. Farewell for now, and remember, in the realm of Friday Night Frights, the terror is only just beginning.